Hi, I'm Ragini Michaels, and I would like to introduce Dr. Jonas Kaplan, who I'm going to be picking his brain for a little bit here. And Jonas is the Associate Director for Mindfulness and Neuroimaging at the Center for Mindfulness Science at the University of Southern California. He's also the co-director of the Dornsfife Cognitive Neuroimaging Center. And I am so thrilled to have him be willing to talk with me here today to help us gain a little more insight into how the brain works and supports us in making this transition around the area of difficult decision making and dilemmas, which is what my work is all about, centered no matter what. All right. And so, Jonas, thank you very much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Ragini, thanks for having me. It's very good to talk to you.
And the work that you primarily do is focused on how the brain functions in relationship to self-concept, identity, story, things like that. Is that your primary interest?
Yeah, that's right. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, and the general project of cognitive neuroscience is to connect the functioning of the brain to how the mind works and to psychology. And you listed some of the things I'm interested in. I kind of go wherever my curiosity takes me, but those are the things I've been most attracted to.
Well, that's interesting to me because the work centered no matter what, which is the program that I'm putting out into the world today, it really deals a lot with your self-concept and your ability to expand both your self-concept and your identity via a different story. Seriously, a different narrative about what are the things that we need to pay attention to in the world that help us make better meaning out of it, that produces less stress. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, because I know you have more insight into how that kind of narrative impacts what's going on in the brain. And my interest is in how it impacts the behavior. So I'm saying they go together. There's no way you can actually separate them. And is that part true, actually, that you can't separate those two?
That you can't separate identity and narrative? Is that? Yeah, I mean, when we look into the neural systems that underlie the self, we see very similar activation patterns compared with when people are thinking about stories, when they're reading stories and hearing stories. And that's because the narrative machinery of the brain is employed in constructing the self. And a large part of our self, at least the self that extends through time, and the self is a complicated entity and involves a lot of things involving how we feel right now. But the self that extends throughout time is basically it's an autobiographical narrative that the brain is constantly constructing. And so yes, that's right. Those two processes are intricately linked.
So that's why I want to talk to you, because my primary interest is helping people expand their self-concept by expanding their understanding about paradox. And that may not seem like it connects, but people seem to make a connection there because they just become bigger in their sense of who they are, when they have a different sense of the world that they're in and a better sense of being able to navigate it. So I have some questions for you. That may or may not seem relevant right now, but I got them listed here, so I'm going to ask them while I got you. Is there a specific part of the brain associated with the subjective experience of feeling centered and peaceful?
Okay, so the answer might be more complicated than you want, but the brain is complicated, and that's
Yes.
part of the difficulty. Generally speaking, there's not a specific part of the brain associated with a particular feeling. Feeling involves many different parts of the brain. The brain is in many ways a layered structure. We have all of these very old structures at the base of the brain that have to do with our old evolutionary history, and we have these layers of newer functions on top. And feeling states involve activity and processes happening at all of these different levels of the brain. And really, our conscious experience is the sum of all of these different processes going on. There are nuclei, centers of clusters of neurons in the brainstem, for example, that get information from our body and are processing those feelings. And the conscious experience of those feelings is then elaborated by higher and higher structures in the brain. So there isn't one region of the brain that's responsible for a specific feeling. There are many systems in the brain, and it's the particular configuration of all of these systems together that makes us feel a particular way. Now, that said, there probably are specific patterns of brain activity across the brain that do have to do with, in particular, the sense of feeling centered and peaceful, feeling happy, or feeling sad.
Okay. So if to make sure I understood you correctly, it's less that a specific area of the brain is targeted. It's more a pattern, a configuration that appears that can be associated with different emotions and things such as peacefulness and calm.
Exactly.
Did I get that right?
You're exactly right. And we are able now to read some of these patterns with our neuroimaging techniques. One of the studies we're doing now is to measure the patterns of brain activity when people feel different emotional states, and to be able to predict what they're feeling based on the brain activity patterns. And we can do that.
That's pretty good, because that's kind of what I'm trying to do is with my own work is make the hypothesis that if you do this process, I predict you will have this experience, right? If you learn how to navigate paradox, you will have less stress, less reactivity, and more calm and more equanimity, which is totally something we need these days. So I'm coming at it from a different place, but I'm glad to hear that actually shows up as a certain kind of patterning in the brain. That's very helpful, I think, to understand. So when you're doing your studies in neuroimaging, and I know you've done a lot of them on mindfulness. I mean, you work in an institute for mindfulness there. So do you consider a difference between presence and mindfulness? Because these two things are often put right together. We're talking about being mindful, bringing your attention to something. Is there a distinction that you make in your studies between presence and mindfulness, or do you use it as the same thing?
Yeah, I don't think we make that distinction. One of the challenges of science and mindfulness has been for everybody to agree on the definitions of these words, and that's in practice it's easy to use them how you want, but in science everybody has to agree on what they mean in order for us to measure them and study them. And mindfulness has been a little bit difficult to pin down in that regard. I mean, I think in general the definition has to do with focus on the present experience without judgment. And that's mainly how we define mindfulness. Presence as a concept is studied in neuroscience in a slightly different context. It might still be interesting to you. One of the contexts that presence has been studied is in the context of virtual reality. So, for example, if you're in a virtual reality experience, what makes you feel immersed in that experience and present in the virtual world, as opposed to, just sitting in your own living room with a mask on, and there are certain brain activity patterns that are associated with really feeling immersed and present in an artificial environment. For example, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is a part of the brain that's involved in conscious, deliberative executive function, seems to be inversely associated with presence. So the more it's active, the less present you feel.
Less presence there is. Okay. Because I'm curious, you mentioned virtual reality, and it brings into my mind the notion of when people talk about manifestation and they're supposed to be seeing things from the end, like they've already happened. So they're looking back at it. I'm going to ask you a question about that later. But is that the same kind of patterning that would show up when you're in virtual reality, that it's so real that you're there? Is that question make any sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think we will probably dive into the way that the brain can generate its own simulations. Being in virtual reality is being in a simulated experience, and the brain is willing to accept simulated experiences, maybe in part because it has practice. So the brain is constantly simulating reality. That's what imagination is, and we use that quite a bit in our thinking. So yeah, it's there.
Okay, yeah, the power of imagination is so fabulous. I want to talk about that a little later. So I have one more question here in this little segment, because I want to do this in a couple of segments, so we're making the listeners out there not driving their mind crazy with all of this. So I talk a lot about there being an option in the brain to either go towards the environment when we meet it or away from it. That we have, those are the two choices that we have, to either go towards the environment or to go away from the environment. I want to know if that's accurate, if there's actually something in the brain that says this is what you have to do when you meet a circumstance. You either go towards it or you go away from it. Is that an actual brain function?
Yes, I think, even more than a brain function, this is a general principle of living organisms in general. If we think back in the history of life, back to our very origins in simple single-celled organisms, for example. The main goal of a living organism is to stay alive, to maintain the integrity of that cell, for example. And the first most important mechanisms for doing that are the systems that allow us to maintain what we call homeostasis, the actual integrity of the organism. If it gets too hot or too cold, we're not going to survive. And so some of the first intelligent mechanisms in life for doing this were to be able to move towards something that was good for us, like warmth or energy, food, and to move away from things that could potentially harm us, if it's too cold or too hot, or if there's a predator or something like that. And this is this kind of distinction between approach and withdrawal is there in very, very simple organisms, and it's something that life has just gotten better and better at over time. And so we do have that basic distinction in our nervous system. Really, that is the basis of value of good and bad, right? And all systems in the brain that decide what's good and we should go towards versus what's bad and we should get away.
Right.
That distinction is very, very old and is embedded within us.
I'm glad to hear it's real and that it's actually embedded in us in our neurology and in every cell, more than likely, from what you're saying. The issue with working with paradox is, or actually just looking at that function when it applies to emotional survival or mental survival, it has a slightly different impact working with somebody who works with minds and emotions. For the last 40 years, most people come in with conflicting emotions and conflicting thoughts in the area of dilemmas or decision making or just life. Is it I want to be good, but I did this and I feel like I'm a bad person now, things like that. So what I've discovered is that when we come with a different perspective that honors that to have survival emotionally and to have mental health, that's actually mental health, that's healthy, there's a better way to do it in that we kind of have to use that both and attitude instead of the either or. So it seems to me that there has to be a way to get into the system, into the brain, that there's a different rule to apply when it's an emotional or mental conflict like that. Because that's what I keep working with for 40 years. People come in and it's always a conflict between two different things inside of them. So can you talk to that a little bit?
You're right. And, this is one of the more interesting things about human psychology compared with, distinguishes us from simpler creatures is that we do have these more complicated layers of emotion where we're able to maintain both positive and negative at the same time. And we think that some levels of the nervous system can't handle such conflicts, the older parts of the brain, but the newer parts that integrate across time and complexity are able to maintain both positive and negative together. And in many ways, these are some of our most interesting emotions and some of our most human emotions, right? You feel nostalgia, for example. It's where you're feeling something positive and something negative at the same time. And, in our research, we've been looking into this and we find that one of the best ways to invoke these kinds of dual complex emotions is with films. Filmmakers are often striving to create that kind of complexity in the experience of an audience. You rarely have a movie that ends on a purely happy note or a purely sad note.
Right.
So this is something that artists try to invoke in us because there is something pleasurable about that mix and there's something important about it for us. So I think that's something that's unique to human psychology.
Yeah, I think so too. One of the things that I've been doing is looking at the psychology of people who are mystics or awakened and they live in one of those higher levels that you've spoken about in the brain, apparently. And there seems to be a different response to that. There's still the beauty of being human and feeling that, that thing that allows compassion and empathy to come up in us, either for ourselves or for others. But there's also a distance from it, a detachment from it that allows something else that maybe is only available when you're into a higher level of the brain. So I want to ask you about that in our next little segment. That's okay. So I'm going to give people a breather here for a minute and we'll be back in just a moment.